And President Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin vowing to take on Syria and North Korea together. The two world leaders speaking on the phone for the first time since U.S. missiles blew up a Syrian airbase last month.
It was a very constructive call that the two presidents had. Very, very fulsome call, a lot of detailed exchanges. So we'll see where we go from here.
President Trump and Putin also agreed to meet face-to-face in July at the G20 summit in Germany.
The leaders of Russia and America have held an urgent phone call in which they discuss Syria and North Korea. Let's cross live now to RT's Ilya Petrenko for more. Hello there, Ilya. So, what was said during the call?
Kate, hi again. Well, we're finally got to a point when we've learned the details both from the White House, which called the phone conversation, quote, a very good one, and also the Kremlin. Their description of it is constructive and businesslike. Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump agreed that all parties must do all they can to end the violence in Syria. And they also want to bring an end to terrorism in the country. And in order to achieve those goals, the presidents have agreed to intensify contacts between their top diplomats, Sergei Lavrov and Rex Tillerson. Another thing that the leaders agreed on is that there's an urgent need to use specifically diplomatic means to de-escalate the crisis on the Korean Peninsula. We understand that soon we're going to find out about more phone calls between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in the future. They'll keep up with that practice, and also they've already discussed their meeting, which is likely to happen with high probability, as the White House and Kremlin are saying, at the G20 summit in Hamburg. Now, just to give you an idea of how anticipated and crucial this meeting was, how desperate the journalists were to find out the details, just take a look at what was happening at Tuesday's White House briefing.
Sean! Come on, Sean! Sean! Wait a minute.
What about the Putin call?
Sean! Where did Sean go?
What is very important is this phone call happened just a couple of hours after the Russian president met the German leader Angela Merkel here in Sochi. That's where they discussed more or less the same issues. That was Syria, Ukraine, the threat of terrorism. And I have to tell you that even though this wasn't really the main issue, there was a question asked about the allegations of Russia's meddling in elections abroad, including in the U.S. So really, we cannot have a high-profile event where things like that are not talked about. This is what Vladimir Putin responded to a question by a German journalist about it.
It never came to our mind to interfere in the political process of other countries. You're referring to the example of the United States, but it was never confirmed by anything or anyone. It's just gossip used in the American internal political battle. And without any evidence, you're making allegations about European countries, including a country as friendly for us as Germany.
So much attention on the city of Sochi and Vladimir Putin's residence here today. We had Angela Merkel visiting, then this phone conversation with Donald Trump, and on Wednesday, the president of Turkey, Tayyip Erdogan, will be here as well. And here on RT, we'll be keeping you up to date.
Yes, certainly a very busy day in Sochi. Ilya Petrenko, thank you very much indeed.
President Trump says he'd be open to a meeting with Kim Jong-un. He said actually it would be an honor to meet with the North Korean leader who is hurling all these nuclear threats at the United States. And there is a collective media freakout over the president's attitude toward Kim and the Philippine president and others around the globe, Vladimir Putin for one, who might be described as strongmen, dictators, totalitarians. For example, the New York Times says that Mr. Trump's unorthodox overtures to a nuclear-armed despot who brutally purged his rivals, that would be Kim and others, illustrated the president's confidence in his ability to make deals, but highlighted his penchant for flouting the norms of diplomacy. The Washington Post, it's no longer just Putin, says the paper. President Trump's affection for totalitarian leaders has grown beyond Russia's president to include strongmen around the globe. And this is a big break with his predecessor, Barack Obama. Now, I don't necessarily think that President Trump should meet with Kim Jong-un, at least not until the end of a long negotiating process where North Korea agrees to freeze or give up its nuclear program. But here's what I think so many in the media are missing. And it's a real dilemma for the press. When the president talks about maybe I'd meet with this one or that one, when he talks tough against North Korea and then softens his tone, this is sort of his style. He talks a lot. He talks out his positions in public. He talks to his aides, outside advisors, decides what he thinks. In other words, it's kind of a moving target. Now, everything a president of the United States says is news, so that you cannot fault journalists for reporting what he says, but it's almost as if, and this applies to the health care bill and all kinds of domestic issues as well, it's almost as if there's this assumption, because this is the way that previous presidents have always done it, that if he says something, we're looking at breaking up the big banks, healthcare, Kim Jong-un, that's the new policy. But oftentimes, that's not the policy at all. It is just, sometimes it's a trial balloon, sometimes it's deliberate, as in the case of renegotiating or terminating NAFTA, and sometimes it may be Trump just being loose with his language. He is not, like so many of his predecessors, a guy who carefully calibrates every word, whose every phrase or sentence is vetted by the federal bureaucracy. That has its weaknesses, that has its strengths, but I think the media need to kind of make an adjustment in the way they report on these things. Some journalists are starting to get it, that this is a process and everything he says is not set in stone. So, for example, just yesterday, Trump tweeting that maybe we need a shutdown in September to deal with the mess. Now, he's not literally saying the government should shut down. He's frustrated about the budget deal, the short-term budget deal done with the Democrats. And he's saying, he's venting in part, and he's also saying, perhaps it would take that kind of shock to the system. He's engaging in some rhetoric. I think people get that. But, there continues to be this view of everything he tweets and everything he says in a flurry of interviews, that everything goes to 11. Now, sometimes he says things that are not true, or, he's historically challenged, such as on Andrew Jackson and the Civil War. And it's fine for the press to call him out on that. And all this stuff, especially how to deal with the craziness in North Korea, is fair game for coverage, scrutiny, and debate. But it's about time we understood that this is a president whose words on these things are not definitive at any moment, but who is figuring out where he stands, who is adjusting on the fly, who is negotiating in public, and adjust our coverage accordingly.
Hi, I'm Laura Ingle. Kim Jong-un's regime is warning both the U.S. and North Korea are at the, quote, brink of nuclear war after an American bomber flight was conducting training drills in the region. Now, the dictator's comments come after President Trump suggested earlier this week in an interview he'd be willing to possibly meet with Kim Jong-un. Meanwhile, the U.S. military's THAAD anti-missile defense system is becoming operational in South Korea, one of the key reasons for Pyongyang's recent provocations against Washington. Here with me to discuss all this and give us some breakdown is former U.S. Army intelligence officer Andrew Peek. Andrew, welcome.
Great to be here.
So we want to get into this and have you help us understand what we're really talking about here with the intelligence that you have in your background. So North Korea, yet again, threatening nuclear war. Not good. How serious are these threats against the United States?
Well, I think Kim is certainly serious, and I think we are closer to a conflict than we have been since he came to power in 2012. I think after a series of missile tests that have failed, Kim has been genuinely humiliated and is looking for some way to kind of show the world that he's still powerful, he's still in control. I think you couple that with a genuinely lower risk tolerance under this president than under the previous president. When Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says the era of strategic patience is over, he's really serious about that. I think that reflects the president's priorities.
And a lot of people say they've been waiting to hear these sorts of words, this kind of messaging happening. And, you know, what is the reaction, you think, here in the United States and worldwide been to this kind of messaging now?
Well, I think one of the genuine achievements of the first 100 days is the assemblance of a coalition against Kim. You know, you've seen China take unprecedented actions, including temporarily banning coal imports from North Korea in response to the president's overtures. So I think there's been a positive reaction regionally. I think I'm a little bit worried in South Korea. They're about to have an election. The South Korean public is not always as supportive of American policy towards North Korea as they might be or as the Japanese are. But I think you have to give the president some credit in assembling a genuine diplomatic counterweight to Kim Jong-un.
And a lot of eyes are on this idea of President Trump suggesting he might be willing to meet with Kim Jong-un. Smart decision, bad decision, the right decision?
Well, I mean, I would only say if President Obama had said that, 10 years ago, all the Democrats would be for it and all the Republicans would be against.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a little bit of political posturing here.
Is it even a reality? Is this something that could realistically happen?
Well, I wouldn't really want to see it myself because it would put America and North Korea on the same level, so to speak. I think under very, very specific circumstances, yeah, it could be a possibility within the context, for example, of the six-party talks, which are our main forum for the denuclearization program.
I want to talk to you about the U.S. military's THAAD anti-missile defense system. It's become operational. So how does that play into recent tensions with the Kim regime?
Well, actually, the tensions with the Kim regime are actually a huge opportunity in this sense for the United States to increase the defenses of South Korea and Japan without experiencing too much Chinese pushback, because the Chinese can't really complain that much if we send them things like THAAD in the wake of North Korean missile tests or nuclear tests. I mean, THAAD itself is a pretty good system. It's about 6 missile launchers, each with 72 operational missiles, and very, very powerful radar that'll be able to sort of offset some of the North Korean and Chinese advantages in long-range missiles.
I think a lot of people want to know kind of the bottom line is, are we safe?
Well, I think we are closer, as I said, to a conflict than we have been for at least 5 years. I think as the days go on and North Korea gets closer and closer to being able to mount a nuclear warhead on an intercontinental ballistic missile, which they are actively trying to do, we're becoming progressively less safe.
Right. Well, it's interesting times for sure. Thank you so much for your perspective. Very important, and we'll have you back. Andrew, thank you so much. And for complete political coverage, you want to stay right here on FoxNews.com. I'm Laura Ingle. Thanks for watching.
And to further discuss this potential conflict in North Korea, I was joined earlier by Hyun Lee. She's a member of the Solidarity Committee for Democracy and Peace in Korea and a Korea Policy Institute fellow. Here's her take on those rising tensions.
I think it's important for us to point out that North Korea has repeatedly offered to freeze its nuclear weapons development in exchange for an assurance from the United States that it will not attack North Korea. But the U.S. has repeatedly rejected that offer. So I think we need to ask why that is. The most notable example is back in 2000 during the Clinton administration, the joint communique signed between the DPRK and the United States, where where North Korea agreed to and did freeze its nuclear weapons development program in exchange for a commitment from the United States to move towards normalization and also a security assurance that it will not attack North Korea. That was immediately undermined by George W. Bush the following year when he took office. But even as recently as 2015, during the Obama administration, North Korea offered to the United States, we will stop our nuclear tests if you stop your military exercises. And that was promptly rejected by the United States. So I think in this situation, we need to be asking ourselves why, when there is a clear path out of this crisis, which is to freeze North Korea's weapons development, which presumably is the U.S. primary concern in this situation, freeze that program in exchange for a security assurance. Why will the United States not choose to do that, but instead opt to escalate tensions?
Well, right now, though, Hyun, we're seeing President Trump seemingly swinging the other way in his approach to Kim Jong-un. He went effectively putting warships on North Korea's coast just last week to this week sounding sympathetic to him. If this is some sort of weird strategy of carrot before the stick, will it work? Does this help fill some sort of like a cultural gap?
I think, Rex Tillerson recently said the era of strategic patience, referring to Obama's policy towards North Korea, is over. But I don't see that Trump's policy is any different from strategic patience. They're talking about increasing sanctions and military threats. That is basically the same policies that the Obama administration had pursued, and that got us nowhere. They're talking about a commitment to denuclearization as a precondition for talks. We know that that's a non-starter because that's been tried before and that hasn't gotten us anywhere. And recently, Tillerson, in an interview with NPR, said, to North Korea, you do not need your nuclear weapons to secure the existence of your regime. But come on, he's saying this even as the U.S. military is conducting exercises that simulate the collapse of the North Korean regime, that simulate the decapitation of its leadership. And also, after the example of Libya, I think the U.S. has very little credibility in that regard.
Now, I'm glad that you brought up Rex Tillerson, because the president's rhetoric towards North Korea, at least at the moment, or at least publicly, doesn't jibe with what the Secretary of State has espoused. Why do you think these two talking points between these two men, who obviously represent the United States' interest, why can't they seem to get their talking points in order? One's the president.
I think the Trump administration doesn't have a clear strategy towards North Korea. Trump is willing to sit down with Kim Jong-un, as he said recently. So that is clearly an opening. But unless the U.S. is willing to work out a fundamental resolution to the current crisis, I think actually the situation is most likely going to get much worse this year. North Korea said earlier this year that it was very close to test launching an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile that can deliver a miniaturized nuclear warhead to the U.S. This is what Washington officials are worried about. That's precisely what they're trying to prevent North Korea from doing, and that's what the recent show of force in Korea was all about. North Korea did not carry out the ICBM test in April, as was expected, so the tension seemed to have eased somewhat, but it still can and will most likely carry out that ICBM test sometime this year. And unless the two sides can come together and work out a fundamental resolution. And by that, I mean really getting at the root of this crisis. So that will include the U.S. stopping its very provocative military exercises, also giving up its nuclear first strike prerogative against North Korea, and then finally working out replacing the armistice that was signed after the Korean War, which is a temporary ceasefire with a permanent peace treaty that guarantees permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula, and in exchange getting a nuclear freeze from North Korea so that they don't do any more nuclear tests.
Now, staying with U.S. foreign policy, today President Trump spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin on the phone. The two leaders talked about bilateral ties and their current geopolitical agenda. A lot has happened since the last time they talked. RT's Alexei Yarashevsky is live over in our newsroom to tell us a little bit more. Alexei, what do we know about the conversation they had so far?
Well, first of all, it's not the first time that the two leaders have spoken over the phone. In fact, it's the third time. The first one happened right after Donald Trump assumed office. The next one was when a terrorist attack in St. Petersburg happened in April, and Trump called Putin to express his condolences. But a lot has happened even since then, mainly and most and foremost the attack on the Syrian airbase by the U.S. military and the preceding chemical weapons attack in Idlib, which Trump back then described as the all-time low in relations between U.S. and Russia. But later in April, he actually tweeted out saying that At the right time, everyone will come to their senses and there will be lasting peace. So what we know from today's conversation, according to the Kremlin's website, is that Syria was obviously the main focus of the talk. The two leaders discussed the possibility of an international mechanism to resolve the issue in a peaceful way, to bring all sides of the conflict to a peaceful resolution, and as well as keeping a constant information about the progress from both sides. You know, the cooperation between the United States and Russia in Syria has been somewhat in short supply as of late, not to mention, of course, the U.S. military strike, which spurned a lot of accusations coming from Moscow that U.S. may have violated international law. But we also understand, according to the Kremlin statement, that the dangerous situation at the Korean Peninsula was discussed as well. Vladimir Putin, according to the statement, again called on restraint and de-escalating the already immense level of tension. And one of the other things that the two leaders have discussed, as far as we understand, is the first meeting between the two presidents, which, as we understand, will be scheduled for 7th or 8th of July in Hamburg, Germany, during the G20 summit. One meeting that probably most of the world is looking forward to, considering how tense the situation is right now.
All right, thanks for that, Alexei Yarashevsky in the RT Newsroom. Earlier, the Russian president held a press conference with his German counterpart, Angela Merkel, in Sochi. The two leaders discussed areas of potential cooperation, such as fighting terrorism and implementing the Minsk agreement in Ukraine. But President Putin also took the opportunity to dismiss accusations of Russian meddling in both German and U.S. elections as just politicized rumors. RT's Ilya Petrenko has the report.
It never came to our mind to interfere in the political process of other countries. You're referring to the example of the United States, but it was never confirmed by anything or anyone. It's just gossip used in the American internal political battle. And without any evidence, you're making allegations about European countries, including a country as friendly for us as Germany.
Indeed, elections in Germany are just a few months away, and earlier this year and even before, there has been a lot of speculation among German politicians and journalists of possible Russian meddling in these elections. And Vladimir Putin once again reiterated that Russia has never interfered or will interfere in elections abroad, and it has nothing to do with the hacking accusations that have been coming from the U.S. and Europe. Speaking of the general vibe of the talks, I have to tell you that it was rather chilly. Not many smiles, no jokes at all, and it went strictly according to protocol, besides the little delays that we have seen today. Many things have been said about Ukraine, the main sticking point, although both leaders agree that there is no alternative to the Normandy format, and it won't change despite France getting a new president.
We should carry on with our efforts in the Normandy format and with the Minsk agreements. We should not undertake new plans without first getting a result from the old ones. Ukrainian authorities are separating the southeastern regions by themselves by organizing different types of blockade.
Undoubtedly, the issue of massive importance today is the threat of terrorism. Now, that is a sphere where it's great to hear both leaders have said that many things can be done together.
The U.S. Senate is holding off on new sanctions against Russia, at least for now. That's according to Foreign Relations Committee Chair Bob Corker, who told Politico his committee will focus on passing new Iran sanctions first. It'll continue with measures to, quote, push back against Russia in Europe. Corker argues he'd like to wait for the Senate Intelligence Committee to finish its investigation into alleged Russian meddling into the 2016 elections before approving any new sanctions. Some senators aren't happy with Corker's more measured approach, though, like Senator Marco Rubio, for one. He stated this. He said, "Anytime is a good time for Russia sanctions." Hospitals across the country are starting to roll out non-addictive alternatives to pain medicine. This is a direct result of opioid epidemics sweeping the nation. Doctors and hospitals are trying new approaches, including mixing a variety of different medications along with techniques like nerve blocks, spinal anesthesia, and numbing lidocaine to attack the pain from different areas. And some hospitals are even prescribing non-opioid prescriptions that are gentler on the digestive tract. It's estimated, though, that 2 million people are now addicted to prescription opioids, and an average of 91 Americans die each day from overdosing with these painkillers. Meanwhile, the Cherokee Nation has filed a civil lawsuit in a tribal court against some of the largest prescription opioid distributions in the world. In recent years, the opioid epidemic has ravaged tribal communities, leaving a trail of death and destruction. RT's Brigida Santos has the story.
13 counties in Oklahoma, legally recognized as the Cherokee Nation, have been hit particularly hard by the opioid epidemic. Opioids are a class of drugs defined by the Federal Drug Administration as powerful pain reduction medications like prescription oxycodone, hydrocodone, and morphine. When prescribed and taken correctly, these drugs can be beneficial, but when misused, they can lead to addiction, overdose, disability, and death.
All around the country, opioids are being diverted from legitimate channels to illegal markets, including at the pharmacy level, where prescriptions are sometimes filled for illegitimate medical purposes. This can happen when drug distributors and pharmaceutical companies don't adhere to safeguards set by the Controlled Substances Act.
In 2015, the Drug Enforcement Agency tallied 2.75 billion milligrams of opioids distributed in Oklahoma. 30% of that amount was dispensed in the tribe's jurisdiction, home to 177,000 Cherokee Nation citizens. Overdose deaths within the tribe now outnumber fatalities from car accidents, despite efforts by tribal healthcare providers to fight prescription opioid abuse.
We're seeing children born addicted to opioids, them having to be in the NICU for weeks and some for months at a time. It causes them tremors and shakes, heart problems, respiratory, also causes developmental delays and cognitive delays as they age.
The Cherokee Nation is now suing 3 distributors and several pharmaceutical companies, including CVS, Walgreens, and Walmart.
The plaintiffs argue that these companies could and should have prevented the opioid epidemic, but instead flooded tribal citizens with prescriptions in the name of profiting. According to court documents, quote, the distribution industry is supposed to serve as a check in the drug delivery system, protecting from theft and refusing to fulfill unusual or suspicious orders. Lawyers claim the defendants habitually turned a blind eye to known problems in the supply chain and acted negligently. They also say distributors knew opioids were being consumed by tribal citizens for non-medical purposes and that the companies failed to train and supervise employees to provide better oversight and control of drug supplies.
There's hardly anyone that you know that hasn't been directly affected in some way. And this is a new type of epidemic because the pills are just so easily accessible, and that is what is creating such a huge problem.
Distribution companies say they stand by their practices, arguing that the lawsuit will not solve opioid abuse. All of them say they are planning to fight the lawsuit. In Los Angeles, Brigida Santos, RT.